Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone, and the Libertarian Institute. Today I am joined by Dr. Chris Freiman. He is a philosophy professor at William and Mary. He's the author of Why It's Okay to Ignore Politics and Unequivocal Justice. Dr. Freiman, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
If you had to nail down the most important lesson you learned from the work of Robert Nozick, 1, 2, or 3, what would you say that is?
I like the question. That's a good question. Well, I don't know. So this might not be the response that you're looking for, although this is what came to mind first. I learned, I don't know, I think the right way to kind of conduct your research as an academic is to pursue the arguments where they lead and not worry so much about the kind of reaction that you might get from your colleagues. So Nozick wrote Anarchy, State, and Utopia. It's a great book. It's one of my favorites. But from everything I've heard, his colleagues weren't in love with it, and he actually suffered social consequences as a result of it. But he wrote the book. And, he taught the courses that, he taught the way he wanted to. And he was very courageous in the way he went about his career. And so that's something that I think is worth emulating and worth learning from. Now, I can maybe give you a more, a response that is more directly connected to some of his actual arguments. So I think maybe Nozick's great insight as a political philosopher in Anarchy, State, and Utopia is that the sorts of reasons that liberal egalitarians like John Rawls give for prioritizing civil or political liberties, so things like freedom of speech, freedom of association, freedom of the press, those sorts of things, and democratic freedoms as well, are also reasons to protect and prioritize economic liberties, like the freedom to own productive property, freedom of contract, freedom of exchange, and so on. And so I think really one way of thinking about what Nozick is up to in Anarchy, State, and Utopia is arguing that a consistent liberalism leads to libertarianism.
What is philosophy, and why do you think it's important?
These are good questions. Well, philosophy, I don't know. I mean, it means love of wisdom. So that's a pretty good start. I think one of the unique features of philosophy, and this also speaks to why I think it's important, is I think it's one of the few disciplines that doesn't really let you take anything for granted. You take a course in chemistry, you can take for granted the existence of chemicals. You take a philosophy course, you can't really take anything for granted. You can't take for granted that there's an external world or anything like that. You have to argue for it. You have to question your assumptions. And so even if you don't become a professional philosopher, and those jobs are pretty scarce these days, so it's maybe not the most promising career path, I think you can learn something from philosophy by internalizing this lesson that, don't take things for granted. Question your assumptions. Things that might seem like common sense might turn out to be false.
I love the thought experiments you give. But one of them is, you can ask people, is it okay to kill one person to, take their organs and then save the lives of 7 people? But if you ask people whether or not it's okay to vote, they will say unequivocally, yes, I'm not even having this conversation. Now, but we don't usually run into this where we are talking to someone and say, should I kill them and harvest their organs to save more lives? This is one of the many great thought experiments in both of your books, links to both of which will be in the description below. What is the importance of thought experiments if we never actually encounter these events in the real world?
Yeah, and I should say that, I wish I could take credit for that particular thought experiment about killing the one and harvesting their organs to save 5. That's an old chestnut. So if you haven't been talking to a lot of people about these sorts of crazy scenarios, that just tells me you need more philosophers on the show. We've got a million of them. But yeah, so I think these thought experiments can illuminate basic moral principles. So I'll just run with the one that you've already brought up. So you have this scenario where you say, look, maybe you have 5 patients, all of whom are dying of organ failure. Each one needs a different organ to live. And there are no volunteers offering up their organs. And so these patients are going to die. However, there's an innocent person who's a match for all 5. So you can kill the one, redistribute their organs, and save the 5. Should you do this? Now, you might say this is not really a scenario that doctors frequently encounter, so what's the point of considering it? Well, the point is to test a principle that might say something like, perform the action that does the most good, or promotes the most welfare, or saves the most lives. And if you think that it's wrong for the doctor to kill the one to save the 5 in that case, then you might not be tempted by this principle that says, always perform the action that saves the most lives or does the most good.
Do you see any important insights in Plato's allegory of the cave?
I do. That's a bit outside my wheelhouse. I haven't done, my philosophy tends to go to 1970. And that's as far back as I go these days. But I do like the allegory of the cave. I mean, I think there's this kind of goes back to the idea that, maybe you shouldn't take common sense for granted. Don't take the way that things appear as the final word. And one thing that philosophy can do is just sort of cast a new light on these issues that have become very familiar to us. And maybe we've become complacent in the way that we think or we act. And like I said, you just, take things for granted. You take people's word for it. But philosophy can, maybe helps you get out of the cave and see the sunlight, for at least for some cases, perhaps. At least that's the hope. That's the hope.
What is the thesis of your book, Why It's Okay to Ignore Politics?
Well, the thesis is it's okay to ignore politics. That's the short version. The slightly longer version is that it's morally better for most people, maybe not everyone, but for most people, if you take the time and energy that you might allocate to politics, to something like preparing and casting a vote, and you reallocate that to other more effective forms of private altruism. So my favorite example is something like earning extra money to donate to the Against Malaria Foundation. This is perhaps the world's most efficient charity. It gives you sort of the most bang for your buck, so to speak. So a dollar sent to this charity is going to do more good than a dollar sent anywhere else. And so my argument is, rather than spend your time on politics, again, for most people, which is very unlikely to produce any good, spend that time doing something that will produce good and potentially a lot of good, potentially saving lives.
How do you respond to the criticism that what the individual does when they're voting, they realize that necessarily their vote doesn't change anything? But just as if I go into someone's house and steal one item, I'm not changing the entire direction of the rest of their life. In fact, they might not even know the item's gone. What the voter is attempting to do is harmonize their interests with the interests of society as a whole by participating in participatory democracy. I forget what the term is, but that's what the voters actually doing. They know they alone are not saving the world. However, they are engaged in an activity which on net will do so. How do you respond to that?
I would draw a distinction between the claim that politics, when practiced collectively, has no impact, which is false. Surely it does have an impact, and an individual's participation in politics having an impact, which frequently it fails to have an impact. And more directly to your question, I would say there are ways of sort of promoting the goals that you might promote via politics more effectively via non-political means. So just very simple example could be something like food insecurity. Maybe you participate in politics because you're worried about food insecurity. You're worried that people aren't getting enough to eat. One option would be researching candidates, their platforms, see how well they respond to this problem of food insecurity, and then go out and cast a vote for the one that you think is best. That's one way of doing it. But of course, your vote is very unlikely to make a difference to whether or not that person gets elected. For all practical purposes, it's not going to make any difference. The alternative is you spend the time that you would have spent on politics on non-political forms of altruism, and in particular, non-political ways of addressing the problem of food insecurity. And there are various ways you could do this. Maybe this means earning to donate to a food bank. Maybe this means volunteering at a food bank. You can use your imagination. But the idea here is that you could still contribute to that goal that you think is important and that you think other political participants are contributing to, say solving the problem of food insecurity. But if you pursue it via non-political means, you'll actually make a difference. You can actually help people get fed who otherwise wouldn't get fed.
Let's say a lot of people read this book and only the very humble people are persuaded by the arguments. Look, I don't have the information, so I'm not going to do this. So I'm going to engage in effective altruism in place of voting. Well, all this does is open up a void for the most evil people without humility to fill this void, making things worse than they otherwise would have been. What do you say to that response?
Well, in part, I love the worry, because you're assuming that the most rational and humble readers will be persuaded by me. So I'm very flattered by this objection. I like this objection. My basic response is I try to be realistic about my impact. So if it were the case that I write this book and I draw a ton of really humble, rational people away from politics, and like you said, there's this new void that's being filled up by people who are not rational and humble, and this makes our politics much worse, that would be bad. However, I just don't think I'm that influential. I'm happy to be wrong. I'm happy to be more influential than I think I am. But I think, I don't know how many people I could persuade with this book. I don't think it's enough to make a difference to something like national scale politics. But if you can, if it changes a few people's minds and they really do shift their attention away from politics and toward effective altruism, then it won't actually have any meaningful impact on politics. That's going to stay the same. But it could mean that some lives get saved that otherwise wouldn't get saved. And so I think that would be a win. That would be a moral improvement.
When it comes to, I believe, the final chapter of the book, you talk about not only is it bad in the aggregate when a bunch of ignorant people waste a bunch of time engaging in political activity, but it's bad for you individually to spend all this time watching the news media, and it's also bad for your relationships. What evidence do you have that engaging in political activities is bad for us mentally and our the closest relationships in our life?
Yeah, so there's a lot of evidence that suggests it's bad for us for our mental well-being, particularly. So just casting your vote and getting on with your life is not a big deal, but it's really the constant attention paid to politics that's bad for us. So constantly scanning social media it causes anxiety, it causes sleeplessness, it actually can worsen our physical well-being. And the thing is, for what? Like I said, it's not as though you can use the information that you acquire in this way to actually make a difference. So we're making ourselves more stressed, more anxious, sleepless, for no further end. And I think that's an additional reason to disengage from politics. And in terms of relationships being bad for our relationships, I mean, there's a lot of evidence now that suggests that an increasing number of people simply refuse to associate with members of the other party. They won't date members of the other party. They don't want their children dating members of the other party. And so, basically you're cutting yourself off from half of the country for political reasons. And, this clearly is going to have a negative impact on your relationship to other people, at least other people in the other party.
Do you see this as a result of the state, well, not only existing, but being so big, like everything it touches, we then have to have a one size fits all policy. So it's not just some hobby that you can have. It's like, look, I want to be friends, but what if I'm an atheist and you're an Orthodox Christian and we get to vote on what religion everyone is? Okay, well, I wanted to be friends, but now I have to violently impose my will on you or I don't get my way, and vice versa. Is this just me engaged in seeing something I already want to see where I pin this on big government?
I think that is part of it. There's this great thought experiment from a Georgetown professor named John Hasness, where he asks us to imagine a world in which the choice of which car you get to drive becomes politically determined. Like the whole country gets one type of car and we vote on it. And he says, well, you could imagine very quickly this becomes a hot political issue. Like, we've become politically divided over the question of cars. Now, as things, like, we're actually kind of a little politically divided over the question of cars now, but imagine how amplified that would be in a world where car choices come under political control. We'd have much more conflict over this issue, where there's not a ton right now. But of course, this is what you see in other cases that are politicized, where you have these choices that could be left up to individuals or individual families, and we could kind of, go our separate ways and we don't have to fight about it, but we're drawn into these conflicts because the state really does have such a wide range of things that it influences these days.
People will frequently see watching the news and reading the newspaper, reading articles on these, news sites as the way that you can accurately get informed. Do you have any superior ways of, let's say, well, we're trying to get people to ignore politics, so maybe I should take a different direction here. If someone really wants to be informed because they simply want to have an understanding of what's going on in the world, what approach would you tell them to take?
Yeah, well, so the first thing I would say is, well, maybe let's take a step back and ask if you really want to do this, if this is how you want to spend your time. But for argument's sake, let's say that you do. So I do think that there are sources that are less partisan than others. I think that's a good start. But it's hard. It's hard. So I think people have this idea that you can become well-informed and unbiased, or have good political judgment simply by reading nonpartisan sources. And I think to some extent that can help. But there's this further obstacle, which is interpreting the information in an unbiased way. So you could just get factual information that seems relevant to politics, but you might be biased in the way that you interpret it. And so it's not enough to just know the facts about politics. You actually have to be able to process it and interpret it in an unbiased way. And that's really hard to do. And as far as I can tell, there's actually not a whole lot of evidence-based strategies for debiasing ourselves. So I think that there are ways to do it that show some promise, but it's not clear how effective they're going to turn out to be. So, for example, it turns out that if people reflect on their own ignorance of the mechanics of policy, they become a little bit more humble. So, in other words, you say, I've got this problem with Social Security, whatever it might be. I don't like Social Security. And then you have them reflect upon whether or not they actually know how, Social Security works. And they go, maybe I don't quite get it. And then they become a little bit more humble, and you can actually sort of open them up to counter arguments and things like that. That might be one way to do it. There are other ways that you might try. Again, it's not quite clear how successful they are, but having sort of friendly conversations without party members about topics that you disagree with, but you kind of start out not with the disagreement, but by discussing things that you do agree about. So you're like, yeah, okay, we're on the same page about this. Now let's talk about that. This also seems to soften up our bias a little bit. The thing is, that's a lot of work. There's a lot of work. It's not clear how effective they are. Like I said, there's some promise, but it remains to be seen, I think, exactly how successful they'll be. You got to acquire all this information, and the payoff is very, very low. So maybe it means you have an informed and unbiased vote that won't make a difference. And so my argument is, don't spend your hours doing that. Spend your hours maybe earning to donate to the Against Malaria Foundation. You spend enough hours and you'll earn enough to save a human life. And that's a much better use of your time, morally speaking, than all of the informing and debiasing work that you might do.
You had mentioned that philosophy is about questioning a lot of assumptions that we have. Could you give us the biggest misconception people on the right have and the biggest misconception people on the left have about the world in general?
That's good. Okay. I don't know. Maybe the biggest misconception. So this is obviously, broad strokes here. People on the right, I think maybe their biggest mistake is thinking that the cosmopolitanism or globalism is bad. I think it's very, very good. Open borders, free trade, All of these sorts of things, I think, are extremely good. They're dynamic. They lead to sort of more robust and diverse societies. So I think if I could persuade the right of one thing, it's that cosmopolitanism is a good thing and should be embraced. For the left, I would say embrace capitalism. Capitalism is good. In particular, it's good for the poor. Maybe if I'm narrowing it down, that might be what I would try to persuade folks on the left of. Is that capitalism is not just good for the Elon Musks of the world. It's good for the rest of us. It's good for people who have cheaper products to buy, who have better products to buy. We have more leisure time. And that probably capitalism is a much more effective way to reduce poverty than a lot of the regulatory and redistributive suggestions that people on the left make.
And how do you know that the reduction in poverty or the increase in standard of living exists as a causal result of capitalism?
Yeah, so I think in particular, when we're talking about something like poverty reduction, my favorite sort of measure of this is the time cost or time price of goods. So you say, for example, what would it? How many hours would the average American have to work 100 years ago to buy a loaf of bread? I don't know what it is. I'm making numbers up, like 10 hours or something like that. And now it's like 20 minutes or something like that. You say, well, okay, well, why is that? What has actually led to that reduction in the time price of that good and many other goods? It's like, well, it's the sort of standard story that we know about capitalism is that you have people competing for your business. They're trying to innovate. If they can sell a better loaf of bread at a lower price, they'll get more business. And so this incentivizes higher quality goods at lower prices. And we just see this. We don't really have an example of non-capitalist societies that have this impressive track record of poverty reduction. And this is an additional comment that might relate to what I would try to persuade the left of. Countries like Sweden, they're capitalist countries in the sense that they do not have collective ownership of the means of production. They're not socialist countries. They're capitalist countries with a lot of redistribution. And we can debate the merits of redistribution, but any country with a high material standard of living is going to be a capitalist country. So where the ownership of productive property is held in private hands. So there's not really a counterexample for this.
It seems like you're not even necessarily taking away the socialist identity if you say that you want private ownership in the means of production. Because if they say, well, I want the workers to own the means of production, well, first of all, it's assuming entrepreneurs don't do any work. So that's ridiculous. But second of all, if you have, well, I think Mises said one of the things to look for to see if a place is capitalist or socialist is whether or not there is a stock market exchange, because this means there is a free market in capital ownership. That's a place where the workers, so to speak, can enter the capitalist arena and own the factors of production. Not just the place they work, they could be diversified and own a few different places. Is this a way that we could actually harmonize our interests with that of the Jimmy Dores, Glenn Greenwalds, and Aaron Mates of the world?
So I think that's an interesting point. I would also say, and more directly, and so you were talking about Nozick early on. He had this point, which I think is really insightful and underappreciated, which he says, look, under capitalism, you can still finance worker-owned democratic co-ops if you want. And we have examples of this. So he in particular was talking about, he said, why don't unions use some money from their treasury to finance these sorts of enterprises? Another example of this would be, I just looked it up recently, but I forget what the number is. But the amount of funding that the Democratic Socialists of America have is quite a lot of money. They have quite a lot of money. And Nozick would say, look, you could take some of that money and fund worker-owned democratic cooperatives if you wanted to. There's nothing sort of formally stopping socialists from doing that in a capitalist economy. But we don't really see a whole lot of that. I think one reason why we don't see a whole lot of that is just because, it's not the case that everybody, or perhaps even most people, want to work in a democratically run worker cooperative. Maybe they just prefer to work for a steady wage and they don't want to have the risk and responsibility of a worker owner. They'd rather have the risk and responsibility of a wage earner. Maybe that's just a preference that people have. But yeah, Nozick would just say there's nothing within capitalism that prevents workers from establishing these sorts of enterprises on their own. But of course, the reverse is not true. So under capitalism, you could collectivize the means of production if you want. But under socialism, you cannot privatize the means of production. And so this is a reason to think that capitalism is going to end up being more respectful of people's values and preferences than socialism will be.
One of the shortcomings of charity, well, I don't, that's unfair because it also applies to the state. But when you think of, well, what people should do is donate to charitable causes, assume that you have, a lot of people who don't have a lot of leverage in the labor market, but they're that they're suffering, unfortunately, and you want to help them. Well, you could engage in charitable practice. One of the issues that arises is that, well, I individually could give maybe $5,000, and that would make a big difference in my life if I gave $5,000 away. And for all I know, it's going to be used at a cocktail reception for even bigger donors. So I'm actually not just going to donate. Everyone else has this similar feeling. It's a big cost for me, small cost in the aggregate. So do you have any ideas on how we could almost harmonize this individual interest and collective interest when it comes to donating to charity to make it a much more attractive option compared to the welfare state?
So is the worry that, you'll donate to an organization and it just won't be used very effectively? It won't end up helping any of the people that you're intending to help. Is that the concern that you have?
There's that surface level, and then there's, well, what do I get out of this? I give them $5,000, okay, and then my bank account has $5,000 less. All right, now I'm done. So unless I can tweet this out and put it on Facebook, and Chris Freiman says, "Hey, Keith Knight did a great thing the other day. Let's give this guy a round of applause. Please follow him." Unless I can do that, it's just not worth my.
That sounds pretty good, though. I'll retweet you. I'll retweet you if you do that. Which that is really a huge benefit, I think. But no, seriously, yeah. So good. So a couple of things. So just on the first point about effectiveness, I think this is a reason why you need to do a little bit of homework before you donate to make sure that you're actually donating to a charity that's effective. And there are effective charities. I would recommend GiveWell as an organization that just does a terrific job of evaluating the effectiveness of charities and telling you the most efficient ones. So that's my remark on the first point. As to the second one, I don't know. I mean, so you think about voting. And you say, well, why do people vote? There's all sorts of reasons why people vote, but they love to get the sticker, the I voted sticker.
Yes.
Yeah. And so you say, okay, the people want to show off that they voted, and they get some sort of I don't know, some sort of psychological reward as a result of showing off the sticker that tells everyone that they voted. And I don't know, maybe we could harness that sort of mindset for the case of charity. So I don't know, an example of this might be something like these fundraisers that people run on Facebook, for example, for their birthday. So they say, it's my birthday. I'm running a fundraiser, let's say for the Against Malaria Foundation. They say, okay, if somebody decides to donate some amount to that fundraiser, and then it actually, or at least you can allow other people on Facebook to see that you've donated. And I'm sort of a results person. I don't mind if your motivation in donating is to get the publicity, as long as you donate. And so if that's what it takes, if it takes your Facebook friends being able to see that you donated to the Against Malaria Foundation, that's fine with me. I'm not going to object, as long as you donate.
I want to take a. Is there anything else I have on this? No. Okay. So when it comes to intentions, sometimes I just want to say, when we're talking about things like, well, yes, it does turn out that the U.S. has more or less formed an alliance with Al Qaeda in Syria to fight Assad, but people support this, but they don't know it. At least their intentions are good. I've been hearing that for so long that I'm at the point with this and a number of other issues where I say, screw the intentions. I'm done having that conversation. But if I really say that, then that means someone who accidentally kills someone with a car and someone who intentionally kills someone with a car have engaged in the same action. The only difference is the intention in their head. How do you, as a philosopher, determine how much weight we can give someone's intention when they commit and when they engage in an activity?
Yeah, so we might care. So to say just a little bit about my own views as a moral philosopher. I'm pretty sympathetic to consequentialism, which is just the idea that what makes an action right is a matter of its consequences. And so, so you do have this worry. You say, well, you could imagine two acts that have the same outcome, that have the same results, but the intention of the actor is very different in the two cases. And so what can you say about that? I think one thing you could say to sort of take the edge off those cases is to separate the way that we evaluate the action from the way that we evaluate the actor. So you might say in the case where, just let's take like an Adam Smithian case where you have one person who benefits another as a result of a free exchange, and they benefit the other person, not really because they care about their well-being, but because they want their money. But they say, look, I'm going to give you this product that you want. You're going to give me the money that I want, and you're going to be better off. And we say, yeah, you made them better off, but it was a kind of selfish intention. You say, yeah, okay, like maybe the action was good, but we don't give a ton of moral credit to the seller in that case, maybe. As opposed to somebody who says, look, I really care about your well-being. I'm not in it for myself. I just want to make you better off. And they benefit you. Same action as the first case, but different intention. Maybe we give the second person more moral credit. But what I'm inclined to say is that those two actions, assuming the actions themselves, it's like an identical benefit to the same person. I'll say, those actions are morally equivalent. But we might give more praise to the second person, to the altruistic person, than to the first person who's merely acting out of self-interest.
One of the thought experiments that is frequently used against utilitarians can go as follows. People with high IQs should more or less enslave people with low IQs. Let's try it and see if it works. 10 years then goes by. There's a lot of bad in the world, so we need a program to restructure the enslavement methods. Let's try these new ones and see if they work. And that was then, and this is now, and things are totally different. So basically, you've created an unlimited justification for why the high IQ people can enslave the low IQ, and you just keep moving the goalpost because you can always say, well, there's shortcomings in the world, and the smart people need to have more leverage over the less wise. What would you, as a utilitarian, say in opposition or support of something like this?
So the short version is that, I would call that an abuse of utilitarianism rather than an appropriate use. So there is this worry, and I think it's a legitimate worry to have, is that if you tell people, look, just worry about producing the best outcome, they're going to use that to rationalize a lot of bad stuff. I think that's a fair worry. But we have to distinguish between what utilitarianism actually implies and how people might abuse it. And so the case that you describe, you say like that's not gonna lead to happiness. That's not gonna lead to social well-being. And so a utilitarian would oppose it. But utilitarianism can be, so you say like there are lots of really terrible things that have been done in the name of the greater good. But a utilitarian is going to say, yeah, but they didn't actually lead to social happiness. That was an abuse of the principle. And any moral theory, in principle, can be abused. And so I don't think that, that differentiates utilitarianism from other views, that it could be abused for bad purposes. And I also think, one thing that some utilitarians say that I'm sympathetic to is, for these sorts of reasons, you don't really want people thinking like utilitarians in their day-to-day life. So you say something like, look, let's just follow some really sort of basic, simple rules of morality, respect other people's freedom and their property, be charitable when you can, and so on and so forth. Just follow those basic rules. that's probably going to lead to more societal happiness than everybody trying to calculate what will maximize societal happiness. I'm somewhat sympathetic to that myself. So a simple analogy in support of that view would be, the case of something like traffic lights. So this is we have very simple rules for traffic. Stop at the red light, go at the green light. Very, very simple. You could imagine an alternate system that says, well, look around, and whenever you think it's going to maximize societal happiness, run the red light. I say that probably, paradoxically, will not lead to the maximization of societal happiness. If people take it upon themselves to calculate the wisdom of stopping at a red light every time, it's going to lead to accidents. It's going to lead to uncertainty. It's going to be people are going to abuse it. All these sorts of things. So just follow the simple rule: stop at the red light, go at the green light. And I think utilitarianism is going to tell us something similar about moral rules. Like, don't hurt people, respect their property, help out when you can. These sorts of things. Don't get out the spreadsheet and the calculator and try to figure out what's going to maximize societal happiness, because that has all sorts of problems. Just follow the basic rules and we'll be fine.
I really enjoyed the book, Why It's Okay to Ignore Politics. It's part of a great series that Routledge does the Why It's Okay series, so I totally recommend it. But one of my favorite books probably ever, because I reread it going over my notes, is Unequivocal Justice. How would you explain your thesis, or what your general aim is in Unequivocal Justice? Link in the description.
Well, first of all, thank you for the kind words about the book. I would say the short version is, so I kind of start with an insight that public choice economists have been promoting for a long time, which is just, you are the same person in politics that you are elsewhere. Mm-hmm. So when you're shopping for soup at the supermarket, that's the same person that you are when you're shopping, quote unquote, for a senator. You're the same person. And so absent some really compelling evidence, we should assume that people are not better, they're not sort of wiser or more altruistic within the political arena than outside the political arena. And I think if we consistently apply this principle, it has significant impacts for the sorts of politics we might want to see. So oftentimes, government solutions to problems start from the assumption that people are bad or flawed or limited in some way. So a simple case that I talk about in the book is something like carbon emissions. And here, this isn't even so much that people are bad. It's just they face this collective action problem. So you say, look, we have this problem. We have too much air pollution. But no individual actually has an incentive to reduce how much they pollute, because it's not really going to make a difference. So you say, I could spend a few extra $1,000s on the hybrid, which will emit less carbon. But that doesn't really make much of a difference to the overall state of the atmosphere. So I'm just going to go with a cheaper car, even though it pollutes more. And so everybody's thinking this way. And as a result, we have too much air pollution. And so we say, okay, well, now this is a justification for some sort of state regulation to ensure that the public good of clean air is provided. That could take a variety of forms. But the problem with this move is that it ignores the way that the motivational problem that gave rise to excessive air pollution is also a problem that applies to the government solution as well. So you say, look, voting well, say for a really well-designed environmental policy, is also a public goods problem. So you say, look, this kind of goes back to what we were discussing earlier. I could spend a lot of time researching different proposals from different candidates and trying to be unbiased and all that sort of stuff, and vote for the candidate who's the most environmentally friendly, and do it in an informed, unbiased way. But of course, you say, well, why would I do that? Because that's not actually going to make a difference, in the same way that buying the hybrid car is not going to make a difference. So if we consistently apply the motivational assumption that sort of generated the need for the state solution, we're going to be a little less enthusiastic about the quality of the governmental solution itself.
In the chapter, Is the State Special?, What are some of the ways you communicate the importance of this specialty of the state? Because people often see it, yeah, it's special. It's the one institution we all share and we can influence. How would you say the state is special?
Yeah, well, so I would say in probably the two most important senses, it's not special. So it's not special in the sense that I don't think that people acting in their role as state actors or political actors are in any sort of significant sense all that different from how they are in their other roles. And this goes back to this idea that you're the same person in the supermarket that you are in the voting booth. So economists sometimes call this behavioral symmetry. You behave the same way inside of politics that you do outside of politics. So in that sense, I don't think the state is special. I don't think voters or public officials are particularly morally different than people are in other domains of life. And then another way, so I don't really talk about this in the book, but I think this is something that libertarians tend to agree upon, that maybe distinguishes them from a lot of other thinkers, is that the state is not special in the sense that the state is more or less bound by the same moral principles as non-state actors. And so the idea here is something like this. If it is not okay in principle for me to do something to you as a private citizen, it would not be okay for me to do that thing to you if I were acting in my capacity as a government actor. So simply putting a badge on me doesn't really change my moral status. So private actors and government actors are bound by the same moral standards. I think that's a second way in which I would say the state is not special. I think most libertarians would say the state is not special. Other people disagree, and they think there is a difference. But I think this is a case where libertarians tend to have very different views about the moral specialness of the state than other people do.
How would you explain John Rawls's original position? This, by the way, Michael Huemer makes the case that John Rawls is probably the most influential philosopher today, and that's why it's so important. I'm not just picking a person at random here. This is who the book is more or less dedicated to refuting. That's why I like it so much. What is John Rawls's original position?
Yeah, no, he's definitely the most influential political philosopher in recent memory. But right, so the original position. So we start thinking about this idea of the original position by asking ourselves, how would we come up with, a fair system of rights and liberties and distribution of resources and things like that. And so one option would just be to sort of, reflect on what we actually believe. So, I'm sitting here and I think, okay, well, what would be a just distribution of income, for example? And whatever I come up with now is a good answer. But Rawls notices there's a problem with this. Namely, I might be biased in certain ways. And it might not even be conscious. It might be a form of non-conscious bias. But just to take a really simple example, if you're really wealthy, you might be biased towards principles that benefit the wealthy. And what we really want is a way to think about justice which is unbiased, which is fair and impartial. And the original position enables us to think about justice in this way. The basic idea here is imagine what sorts of principles of justice you would choose if you didn't really have any information about yourself as an individual. So you don't know what race or gender or religion you are. You don't know what your income is. You don't know what your profession is. You don't know what your education level is. You don't know any of this stuff. And so the question is, not knowing this, what would I choose? And the idea is that in the original position behind what Rawls calls the veil of ignorance, you're forced to choose principles that are good for everyone. It wouldn't make sense for you to choose biased principles. So, for example, maybe you're deliberating in the original position. You think, okay, well, what about a law that discriminates against a particular religion? Should I endorse that? The answer is clearly no, you shouldn't endorse it. Because when the veil of ignorance is lifted, when you sort of are in the real world, it could turn out that you're a member of that religion. And so it would be irrational for you to endorse a principle that discriminates against it. And so the idea is that the original position forces us to choose principles of justice that are fair, are unbiased. And, the basic principles that Rawls thinks people would choose he thinks we would choose, protection of basic liberties, civil liberties, the sorts of stuff you see in the Bill of Rights, equality of opportunity, and what he calls the difference principle, which is basically that the just distribution of wealth and income is the one that maximizes the material well-being of the poorest people in your society. And the idea there is basically, look, if you didn't know if you were going to be really rich or really poor, it makes sense to sort of cushion the blow as much as possible if you turn out to be among the poorest in your society.
Did they not have casinos in the 1970s when he was writing? Does he not know people love taking big risks sometimes? I mean, does he know what cave diving is? People go to the bottom of caves and almost suffocate themselves just for the rush. What? How did he get away with something so ridiculous?
Well, so I mean, this is a criticism that people make is they say, look, Rawls, you're being really risk averse here. So particularly when we're talking about the difference principle, where you say what you want to do. So he talks about maximin reasoning. And the idea is you maximize the minimum. So you make the minimum income as high as possible. And this is a very low risk choice, as you say. It basically, so it doesn't really matter how much you can get if you're sort of at the top of the income distribution, or even really what the average is. It just matters that if you turn out to be in sort of the at the bottom of the distribution, you have as much as possible. And this looks very risk averse. So I mean, one argument, I mean, I'm sympathetic to this objection that it's too risk averse. I mean, one thing if you want to meet Rawls halfway, and I think this is a sensible option, is you say, look, it makes sense to want some kind of basic minimum. So the idea is, we want to make sure that nobody falls below, this amount of money per year. But then above that, maybe we do something else. Maybe we maximize average income or something like that. That's a different principle. Is make the lowest income as high as possible. It's just that, look, there's a threshold we don't want people to fall below. That makes a lot of sense. But above that, let's make society as rich as we can. That strikes me as a better principle than Rawls is. But he, his basic view is, look, if you don't know where you're going to end up, it makes sense to be really risk averse, because he's having you imagine that you're choosing this principle and you got to stick to it for the rest of your life. And so maybe you are the high roller who says, all right, I could either be a billionaire or have nothing, but I want to take this risk. Rawls says, well, look, suppose you take the risk and you lose, and you end up with nothing once the veil of ignorance is lifted. He thinks that's going to be extremely difficult for you to stick with and live by. And so this is why he thinks it makes sense to be pretty cautious here, because we want to make sure that people are actually able to live with the outcomes that they would choose in the original position.
I still don't see how, even if you want something like that, you would not choose a system where some people have the right to initiate violence against others and others have the obligation to obey. I mean, I read Justice as Fairness. I have not read A Theory of Justice. How does Rawls square this circle where he says equality is really important? Also, the state has the right to make demands. Everyone else has the obligation to obey.
Well, so in Rawls's view, the state has the permission or the right to impose moral obligations on people, for the sake of equality, as long as they don't infringe on people's basic liberties. And so this kind of goes to some of the Nozick-Rawls dispute. So Rawls is going to say, look, the state can't bring about equality by redistributing organs, for example, to return to that case. So that would be one way of rectifying a particular inequality, is by redistributing organs. But he says we can't do that because that's going to violate people's basic right to bodily autonomy. So that's ruled out. But he did think that, say, taxing wealth and income was a permissible way of realizing equality, because he wanted to say, look, people don't have this basic right to their property, or at least productive property, in the way that maybe somebody like Nozick thinks that they do. So even though a lot of ways of realizing equality are going to be ruled out in the original position, there will still be permissible ways of doing it, most notably through things like regulation and redistribution. He doesn't think that that's an impermissible infringement on people's liberty.
Okay, so let's give the Catholic Church the unilateral right to regulate and redistribute, since this doesn't violate anyone's rights. I'm sure everyone's going to be happy, and they'll say, you know what, so long as I get to vote for the Pope once every 4 years, then everything they do is totally okay.
Well, so Rawls would say you can't do that in the original position because you might not be Catholic.
Well, I might not be a part of the government in the Rawls in the Rawlsian world. Do you think? Obviously, I'm just being ridiculous about this, but I think it's really important because he doesn't seem to have too high standards for his own government supremacist position, what I would call. Are there any real intellectual contributions you think that I am not appreciating of people like Rawls?
I mean, I like the original position. I think it's a really interesting and illuminating thought experiment. I think that he, with the theory of justice and some of his work, beyond that, he really revitalized liberalism in analytic political philosophy. So yeah, I mean, I have many disagreements with Rawls. Like you said, that the first book contains many of them, but I do think he made a lot of interesting contributions. And let me just say a little bit too. A part of my disagreement with Rawls, and this is what I detail to some extent in the first book, Unequivocal Justice, is he doesn't take seriously the possibility that state power is going to be abused, because he's doing what he's very explicit about this. He's not denying that he's doing this, but he says, look, I'm doing ideal theory, which means I'm assuming that people are perfectly just. This is my project. My project is figuring out what a realistic utopia would look like. So this means, we can't assume that people can flap their arms and fly. That's not realistic. But let's assume that people are as good as humanly possible. They're as just as humanly possible. Then what would it look like in that world? What would justice, or what would a state look like in that world? And now I think one issue with that is, if you're assuming that people are as good as humanly possible, then you can just kind of dismiss the possibility that state power will be abused or used improperly for other sorts of reasons. And then that sort of, I think, stacks the deck against something like libertarianism from the start. Because a lot of libertarian concerns about state power just look, if it were run by angels or even human beings as good as we could realistically be, then we'd be maybe friendlier to a lot of the stuff that Rawls is talking about. But the state is not run by angels or people as good as they possibly could be, and so that's a reason to keep its power pretty limited. And so he doesn't really take that sort of objection seriously, and I think that's not giving a fair shake to a lot of his critics.
When it comes to his approach to dessert, he will say things like, if you have a lot of money, well, you just happen to be born in a society that allocates money toward a thing you happen to be good at. And whether, let's say you don't work hard and you inherit it. Well, you didn't earn it. Let's say you work hard and earn it, so to speak. Well, you didn't choose in this original position to have these skills, which give you the willingness to work hard. So therefore, basically, no one deserves anything up to and including, I guess, life itself. How do you, as a philosopher, approach moral desert and what people can justly own and claim as theirs versus things they do not have claims on?
I confess I'm actually sort of sympathetic to that argument from Rawls. However, I don't think that this has the implications that he thinks it does. So let's go back to Nozick, for example. Nozick is very explicit that he's not defending libertarianism or free market capitalism on the grounds of desert. So he's perfectly willing to say that there could be somebody who inherits a lot of money from their parents and they don't deserve it. So maybe they're just a bad person. Maybe they were, a bad kid, like all this stuff. Like they don't, whatever standard you want, they don't deserve it. Nozick's going to say you could still be entitled to it in virtue of the fact that it was somebody's money and they voluntarily transferred it to you. Now, you might say there are cases of people acquiring money in a market system that aren't like that. So they work hard and they produce something that people value, and those people give them their money. You say, look, that person deserves their income. Like that also makes sense to me. I don't know if we start saying, well, but the character that they had that enabled them to do this, they didn't really earn that. I don't know. I'm not entirely sure what to think about that. If it really is the case that, ultimately speaking, nobody deserves anything. I could be persuaded of that, perhaps. But I think, Nozick is on stronger ground where he says, look, it's not about desert. It's about entitlement. Something can be yours even if you didn't earn it. So he says, look, it could be your kidney. You could be entitled to your kidney. I can't take your kidney. Even if you didn't earn your kidney, like you didn't really work for your healthy kidney, but it's still yours. You're entitled to it. And so this is kind of Nozick's way of defending the market. He's like, maybe a lot of it's not deserved, but you could still be entitled to it.
Yeah, I think one of the things one of the methods of thinking that I learned in Unequivocal Justice is taking this principle and honestly saying, well, does this apply? And then saying, well, does it also apply to the state? Well, why does Congress have the right to make laws? They just happen to be elected in an election they happen to win with voters that happen to live in a district that happen to vote for them instead of the other crook they were running against. Why should I have any obligation to them? So it's like Rawls and company have the ultimate skepticism when it comes to anything the average person wants to do, and no skepticism when it comes to governments, which after all their histories of mass murder, he doesn't think it's worthy of questioning whether or not they can be subject to corruption. I just think it's one of the most dangerous things, not because everyone I know reads Rawls, but because they put these assumptions out there, and then the average person gets them, and that's how they sort of gain this this popularity.
And one thing I mentioned just briefly in the book, but I hope it's illuminating, is that a lot of people would recognize how strange Rawls's move is if we applied it to the market rather than the state. So we say, well, just imagine, like here's how I'm going to defend libertarianism and capitalism. Assume that consumers are always perfectly rational, that they're perfectly informed, that they always make choices that are best for the community as a whole. And, the same is true of capitalists themselves. And you say, look, boom, I've vindicated libertarianism. Somebody would roll their eyes and they'd be like, come on, like, no, you had, like, maybe in this like really strange philosophical thought experiment you have, but what does that have to do with the real world? And I would say, yeah, like, point well taken. That's a fair point. I haven't really done a whole lot to vindicate it. But when we apply those assumptions to politics, for some reason, people are just much more receptive. Oh, yeah, I guess let's assume that voters are rational. Let's assume that they're voting for what's best for society. Let's assume that politicians are not out for their own self-interest. Well, yeah, okay. Like in that case, I can understand why you'd want a lot of, government power. But what does that really tell us about the real world? And my answer is not much, if anything.
Few more questions for you, Dr. Freiman. Thank you so much for being generous with your time. People will often say what matters is a sense of belonging, identity, and community, or what we should strive for is equality of outcome or opportunity. Why is it that you put economic freedom or freedom in general so high on the list of what are issues, why we should care about something? Why does freedom really matter?
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is because it works in the sense of making us better off, making us happier, healthier, like more prosperous, more peaceful. And in terms of so for example, again, you just look at countries where people have their rights protected, where there are high levels of material well-being, high levels of subjective well-being. That they're societies that are free, that like by liberal standards, liberal in the sense of like the sorts of liberties that we would see on the Bill of Rights and things like that. So that's the basic answer as to why I think freedom is so important, because I think it's the most important part of creating a society that advances our well-being. And I would also say too, with equality, a lot of people I think tend to confuse a concern for inequality with a concern for poverty. So I think it would be strange to care about inequality as such. So you have somebody who has $10 billion and somebody with $1 billion. And you say, oh, what a huge inequality. But who cares? They're billionaires. They're super rich. And I think when you present that kind of case to most people, they say, yeah, I don't really care about that. You say, okay, well, what does that tell you? It tells you don't really care about the gap between people. What you care about is ensuring that people have enough. What you really care about is poverty, not inequality. And so my view is, I don't care if there are people out there who are making, tens of billions of dollars like that. That's great. That's totally fine. What I care about is having a system that, enables people to avoid poverty. And it turns out that society, like, for example, there's not a society that's done an effective job of addressing poverty that doesn't have billionaires, for example. So prosperous societies, societies that do a good job of taking care of poverty are societies that allow billionaires. And so this tells us something about the capitalist system. Like, it's good to allow people to accumulate wealth if it's part of a system that ultimately redounds to the benefit of people who are in poverty.
And then just two more questions about former guests on the show. What is the most important thing you learned from or intellectual contribution of Michael Huemer?
Well, I mean, he's great. It would be tough to list all of them. I think his work in the problem of political authority is just excellent. So, I would wholeheartedly recommend that people listening to this read that book if they haven't already. I'm always teaching a bunch of his work on gun rights, immigration, the drug war. So look up all those as well. And he also actually, so I'm just giving you a bunch of recommendations now. But he has this great piece, and it's also on video, why people are irrational about politics. And that's worth a watch for sure. It does a really great job of explaining, why people are biased and uninformed about politics, and also what lessons to draw from this.
And finally, most important contribution of Jason Brennan.
Oh, here again, so much great stuff. Part of it, one of his great contributions is kind of, I don't know what you might call like de-romanticizing democratic theory. So he says, like, when we as political philosophers are talking about democracy, let's talk about how democracy works in the real world with real people, with their interests and their biases and all of these sorts of things. And I think that's been a huge contribution. But here again, too numerous to count. He's done terrific work on immigration, on libertarianism. Why Not Capitalism is a terrific book too, where he talks about this. He really produces this great insight, which is, and this is something that, I talk about his case in Unequivocal Justice as well. There's this tendency when people are comparing socialism to capitalism to compare idealized, flawless versions of socialism to real world capitalism with all its flaws. And he says this is not a fair comparison. If you're comparing ideal socialism to ideal capitalism, then ideal capitalism looks pretty good. It looks better than ideal socialism. If you're comparing real world socialism to real world capitalism, capitalism still comes out on top. And so you just have to be on guard against this tendency of comparing idealized fictional socialism to realistic capitalism. What you want is the apples to apples comparison. So again, he's got a ton of contributions that I would recommend checking out as well.
The books are Unequivocal Justice and Why It's Okay to Ignore Politics. Dr. Freiman, thank you so much for your time, sir.
Thanks for having me.